My wife asked if she could go to another man's house, and in that instant, everything between us fell apart. "You can go, and take advantage of it so you don't come back," I said, pain clogging my throat, each word coming out ragged, unfiltered, unforgiving. She hadn't expected me to release the chains so quickly, hadn't expected me to turn my back on what was left of us so firmly, but the truth is, inside, I had already died weeks ago. What she heard in that moment wasn't just an answer, it was the sound of the end. The end of a story I'd tried to save alone, while she handed our moments over to another. She left without looking back, carrying a backpack too small for everything she'd destroyed. Her eyes had the gleam of someone who believed she was heading toward what she called freedom, what she called passion. And I, bleary-eyed, remained there, before the still open door, feeling the echo of an absence that would never return to presence, trying to understand when we stopped being us so she could be only hers and him. There were no screams, no scenes. The betrayal didn't come with the smell of cheap perfume or a lipstick stain. It came subtly. It came through constant absences. Through short answers. Through the coldness in bed and the face-down cell phone. It came silently, like someone walking away from a love, ashamed to admit they no longer want them, but cowardly enough not to have the courage to leave. I noticed. Little by little, Sundays became lonely, even with her by my side. Her smile was no longer mine. Her gaze, even less so. But what hurt the most was realizing that, even with the chance to go back, she chose to leave. She chose him. And I was left, with the emptiness. With the shards. With the memory of what we were and the humiliation of what she made of us. The day she asked me that was confirmation of what I already knew. She wasn't just a friend. She never was. But she still had the audacity to look me in the eye and ask, like someone asking permission for something small, trivial, like saying, "I'll be back soon." But there was no going back. From that moment on, she crossed an invisible line, from which neither of us would emerge the same. I, with the bitter taste of helplessness of someone who loved alone. She, with the unconscious arrogance of someone who thought she had somewhere to return. What she didn't know is that when you destroy someone inside, you can't expect the door to remain open when you decide to return. Because when a heart closes, it's not with a lock, it's with trauma. And she went. She went with the light body of someone who thinks she's choosing what she wants, but with a soul unaware that she's losing what she had. And the worst part is that, for a while, she seemed genuinely happy. The photos on social media with forced smiles, the places we used to go together now occupied by a stranger. A man who took advantage of the gap, who fit in where I was hurt. And me? I kept quiet. I sank. I spent sleepless nights reliving every detail of our story, wondering what I did wrong, where I wasn't enough. But over time, the pain gave way to lucidity. And lucidity showed me that love that fades at the first breath of temptation was never love, it was convenience. And that fidelity is a daily choice, not a consequence of being married. There were months of silence. Of reconstruction. Of starting over. To grieve in silence is the cruelest form of suffering, because there is no one to wipe away your tears when they fall. But it is also there, in this lonely abyss, that we learn to find ourselves again. I learned. And it was in this morning that she became the past. Not of memory, but of feeling. And that was when life surprised me. When I no longer expected it, when my heart was weary, someone arrived. Not with promises, but with presence. Not with pretty words, but with simple gestures. And most beautiful of all, with truth. A calm, whole love that didn't need to be shouted because it was felt. With her, I relearned to smile. I relearned that being loved isn't about begging, that respect isn't demanded, it's natural. And for the first time, after so long, I felt chosen. Without shadows. Without past. Without remains. But fate, ironic as ever, decided she needed to see what she'd lost. It decided that life exacts interest on love that is scorned. Because it was when she discovered the other man wasn't home, wasn't love, wasn't a promise kept, that she returned. Not with flowers. Not with tears. She returned with regret in her eyes and shame in her posture. She wanted to talk. She wanted to explain. She wanted to say she'd made a mistake. But by then it was too late. The time it took her to leave was enough time for me to no longer want to see her return. Because the love she betrayed was the same one that now blossomed in another woman. And there, before her, I realized that forgiveness exists. Not to save lives, but to free the hearts of those who have been hurt. She apologized. She cried. She said she felt empty. That the other person didn't know her like I did. That no one called her by that silly nickname I'd invented anymore. That things weren't fun anymore. That the bed was too big. That the coffee had no flavor. That the laughter wouldn't come. That she even missed the sound of my breathing when I slept. And I, with a lump in my throat, looked at her and smiled with the calm eyes of someone who no longer felt anger, but also no longer felt love. I said it was okay. That I forgave her. But that there was no longer room for her in my life. That it was too late. And there, in that moment, she felt what I'd felt months before, the bitter taste of loss. The difference is that I lost someone I loved, and she lost someone who truly loved her. Perhaps this is the worst pain. Not the pain of being betrayed, but the pain of realizing that the love you let slip away was the only true one. Because no matter how much time passes, some things never come back. People who don't wait. And mistakes that cost too much to fix. I moved on. With my whole heart. With a new love. With peace. And she stayed. Not alone, but without me. Which is almost the same thing. But what she never knew, is that I, too, made a mistake. One that changed everything before she even left. One I carry with me silently, and that maybe, just maybe, explains why she chose to leave. A secret I've never told anyone, and that, deep down, might be the key to understanding how everything fell apart. Welcome to the channel. Here, we don't romanticize cheating, ever. All stories are fictional, but they carry hard truths. Betrayal destroys homes, hearts and futures. Our goal is clear, to show how one wrong choice can change everything, forever. Get ready. What you're about to hear is a story strong, shocking and realistic, made for mess with your emotions. Take a deep breath, the story will begin. They met simply, as the most memorable stories do. It was in a small, almost hidden cafe, on an ordinary autumn day. He, his eyes tired from a long workday, just wanted a strong coffee and some silence. She, leafing through a yellowed book, seemed oblivious to the world around her. It was chance, or perhaps fate, that brought them side by side at that shared table. They exchanged brief words at first, shy smiles, a kindness here, a comment about the weather there. And little by little, like water filling every corner of a glass, they began to fit together. There was an unforced naturalness between them, a lightness that couldn't be explained. His name was Ethan, hers was Julia. Two common names, two souls who discovered their uniqueness in each other. Ethan was the kind of man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders without complaint. Hard-working, disciplined, with a sense of responsibility that sometimes suffocated him. He came from a simple family, where love and effort always went hand in hand. He wasn't one to make empty promises or give in to impulses. When he gave himself, he was wholehearted. Julia, on the other hand, had a restless, creative aura, full of dreams and loose ideas that she didn't always know how to realize. He came from a somewhat more unstable home, where affection was always present, but it was confusing, often conditional. Perhaps that's why she feared stability, even though she secretly craved it. Ethan offered her this, the security of a haven, the constancy of someone who would be there, even when she herself didn't know where she was going. Their courtship unfolded gently, unhurriedly, yet deeply. Within a few months, their meetings became routine, Sundays began to smell like pancakes cooked together, and movies were watched under the same blanket. There was a clear connection, the kind that makes outsiders comment that they were made for each other. And perhaps they were, at least at that point in their lives. Ethan loved Julia with an almost silent devotion, caring for her in small gestures, water by her bedside, a coat offered on cold days, the car filled with gas without her having to ask. Julia, in turn, found in Ethan a foundation she'd never had, and it frightened her. There was a part of her that wondered if this was love or just a comfort zone so rare she clung to it tightly, even though she didn't know how to reciprocate. They married 2 years later. A small, intimate ceremony, surrounded by sincere smiles and heartfelt promises. The house they bought together wasn't large, but it was cozy. Light walls, hand-picked furniture, every corner filled with memories being made. In the first few months, Julia devoted herself to the home with enthusiasm. She decorated with detail, made grocery lists with little hearts next to them, dreamed up themed dinners, and placed fresh flowers in the living room. Ethan, always attentive, was grateful. He'd come home from work eager to walk through the door and be greeted by her embrace, the smell of her favorite food, the feeling that, finally, he had a home. They laughed a lot. They talked for hours. They planned trips, children, the future. There was a complicity that seemed unshakable. But like every love story that transforms, the change began slowly. First, it was the schedule. Ethan started coming in later. Work demanded more, and he, committed as he was, couldn't say no. Julia, who had previously thrived on their routine as a couple, began to feel lonely. Dinners became foil-covered meals in the microwave. Conversations became shorter. Laughter became less frequent. She tried to signal. She said she missed him. That the nights were getting too long. That she didn't want to be just the end of someone's tired day. Ethan listened. He tried to balance. But the world outside took its toll, and he believed all of it, the extra hours, the effort, was for them, to build something better. He didn't realize that, while he was building the pillars of the future, the foundations of the present were beginning to crack. Julia, for her part, began to withdraw. She spent more time away, immersed herself in personal projects, courses, and meetings with friends. She wanted to fill the void growing inside her, but didn't know how. Sometimes, when Ethan came home late, he'd find her already asleep on the couch, a glass of wine half finished, a series paused on the screen. Other times, she pretended to sleep, turning to the side, avoiding contact. His touch, once desired, became avoided. Not for lack of love, but for accumulated frustration. Silence began to speak louder than any dialogue. Small gestures, once constant, became rare. But even with the growing distance, there was still affection. On the right days, they still knew how to find each other. They still laughed together. They still shared looks that said, "I know you." But these moments became increasingly rare, like small islands in an ocean of routine. Friends understood, but didn't know how to intervene. Some said it was just a phase. Others said marriage really does change. Julia listened to too much advice and felt too little emotion. Ethan, absorbed in his responsibilities, saw her sadness as temporary. He believed that, with more effort, everything would resolve. That all it took was endurance. That love endured. That time healed. He failed to see that love also needs to be nurtured. That presence isn't limited to being under the same roof. That sometimes, the most painful absence is the one of a gaze. And hers no longer sought his as often. Then came the work trips. The weekends were disjointed. The birthdays were celebrated in a rush. Complicity gave way to formality. There were no longer so many new photos on the wall. No longer so many fresh flowers. The house, still beautiful, began to feel like nothing more than a functional space. Ethan understood the signs, but couldn't name them. Julia felt the distance, but couldn't express it. Between them, an invisible barrier grew. And behind the smiles at family gatherings, there were unasked questions, suppressed tears, stifled desires. Neither of them spoke about it, as if ignoring it were enough to contain the inevitable. But the inevitable, silent and patient, always finds gaps. At some point, the imbalance becomes unsustainable. Love, however genuine it may have been, begins to hurt when it's no longer reciprocated. And it was at this point that their story began to change. Not yet with obvious snaps or confessions. Not yet with slamming doors or screams in the middle of the night. But with small deviations. Words left unsaid. Truths avoided. And the persistent feeling that something important, was slipping through their fingers, and neither of them knew how to hold on to it. Ethan kept believing. Because that was the kind of man he was. Someone who bets until the end, even when everything seems lost. Julia, deep down, was already struggling with confusing feelings. There was guilt, there was emptiness, there was longing for what they had been. But there was also need, a vague desire to be seen again. To feel again what she could no longer find at home. They lived under the same roof, but in different worlds. She in search of meaning. He in search of stability. And life, merciless, waited for the exact moment to put everything to the test. On the surface, they were still a couple. Neighbors saw them smiling in the yard, parents asked about their children, colleagues praised their partnership. But inside, their story was already beginning to crack. No scandal, no apparent tragedy. Just the natural wear and tear of two hearts that, though still beating strongly, no longer beat in time. There was no betrayal yet. There was no breakup yet. But there was already something more dangerous than that, the slow oblivion of love. The gradual transformation of an us into two lonely eyes, trying to remember what it was like when everything made sense. And it was at this point in the journey, precisely at this point, that fate began to bend. Still invisible, still silent, but about to change everything. Because what came next wouldn't just be a choice. It would be a consequence. One of those that can't be undone. One of those that leave scars where promises once stood. And the cruelest thing is that, even without knowing it, they were both already one step away from the abyss. Ethan woke up every day before sunrise. The alarm clock rang at 5:30 a.m., but most of the time, his eyes were already open before the sound even invaded the room. His body accustomed to the routine, his mind still wandering between the calm of the night and the weight of the tasks that awaited him. He slipped out of bed quietly, placed a light kiss on Julia's forehead, who rarely moved, and went to the shower, trying to convince himself it still made sense. He made his own coffee, drank it in silence, gazing out the kitchen window at a neighborhood still asleep, and then headed to work as if carrying an invisible mission, to be the man who sustains, who protects, who never gives up. He still believed that effort was love, that sacrifice was proof. But what I didn't know was that, on the other side of town, while he typed reports, held meetings, and struggled to secure a solid future, the present was already slipping through the cracks of what they had once built together. In recent weeks, Julia had changed her routine. She'd become involved in a community art project at a cultural center, a place she'd frequented since college but had neglected in recent years. Now, with more free time and a growing desire to rediscover some version of herself, she threw herself into it wholeheartedly. The center was bustling, vibrant, full of young idealists, teachers, artists, loud voices, colorful walls, and intense gazes. There, Julia felt alive. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't just someone's wife. She was heard, admired, called by name. She felt seen. And this, for someone who had felt erased for so long, was a sweet, addictive drug. At first, it was just a relief. An escape from the monotony that ate away at her insides. But, as happens when one lives in a state of need, any gesture of attention begins to feel like love. It was there that she met Davi. A literature professor, he spoke calmly, had a deep gaze, and an unpretentious way of offering praise. He had a habit of stopping what he was doing to truly listen, without distraction, without rushing. And when he looked at Julia, it wasn't with the familiarity of someone who already knows what she's going to say, it was with the freshness of someone still discovering. This, for her, was new. It was strange. It was dangerous. But it was irresistible. At first, they exchanged mere conversations between classes and events. Then came the messages. The late-night coffees. The laughter. The shared secrets. Until one night, after an exhibition, he walked her to her car, and she, without planning, without rationalizing, simply gave in. The kiss happened quickly, urgently, as if it had been pent up. And in that moment, everything changed. It was no longer about neediness or distraction. It was about crossing a line. And she crossed it. Julia returned home that night with trembling hands and a racing heart. Ethan was already asleep, as always, on his side, his face serene. She lay there for a few minutes, watching him in the dark, trying to understand what she had just done. Was it love she still felt for him? Was it guilt? Was it fear? Or all at once? She went to the bathroom and cried silently, swallowing the bitter taste of betrayal. She didn't regret it immediately. Regret would come later, diluted by other encounters, other apologies, other lies told with frightening ease. But that night, she knew nothing would ever be the same again. Because once you betray yourself, even your own reflection in the mirror becomes a stranger. In the days that followed, Julia tried to act normal. Ethan, as always, seemed oblivious, trapped in his own world. But something in her gaze was beginning to sink in. There was an absence that could no longer be explained by routine or fatigue. It was more subtle. It was as if she were there, but not. As if her body were present, but her soul elsewhere. He tried to ignore it, tried to pretend it was all in his head. But her scent had changed. Her touch was different. The way she held him, the way she kissed him, the way she avoided his eyes during conversations. Distrust grew inside him like a poisonous plant that coils itself around his insides until he could no longer breathe. Still, Ethan didn't confront her. Maybe out of fear of confirming it. Maybe out of pride. Maybe because, deep down, I still wanted to believe everything could be saved. But he began to observe. I wrote down schedules. I noticed the delays, the long showers, the smiles on the phone, the uncomfortable silences. He began to piece together pieces that didn't fit. And when, one random Saturday, she said she was spending the weekend at her sister's house, he knew. He wasn't completely sure, but inside him, something screamed. Something irrefutable. She hugged him before leaving, told him she loved him, and he returned it with a calm kiss. But inside, something in him was dying. For the first time, Ethan felt like he was just an extra in the life of the woman he chose to love. While Julia was away, or so she was, he stayed home. He cleaned, tidied, thought. He relived memories. He searched the house for any sign, but found nothing. She was careful. Very careful. More than he'd imagined. He looked at the photos of them together on the shelf, the wedding album, the old notes stored in a box. It all seemed like a lie now. A stage set for a play he didn't know was finished. The silence of the house suffocated him. Her absence, which had previously been merely annoying, was now like a scream echoing through the halls. He felt small, powerless, betrayed even without proof. And it ate at him. When she returned Sunday night, he was sitting on the couch, his eyes fixed on the door. She walked in casually, dropped her bag, took off her shoes, and asked if he'd had dinner. He nodded in response, and they stared at each other for a few seconds too long. Julia looked away, went to her bedroom, showered, and lay down. Ethan remained there, in the dark, staring at the ceiling. He wanted to scream, to question, to accuse. But he didn't. Because what hurt him most wasn't the betrayal itself, it was the way she continued to pretend everything was fine. As if he were stupid. As if he didn't even deserve the truth. And so it went for a few more days. A game of appearances. A silent dance between two bodies that no longer truly touched. Until that night came. The night everything finally broke. Julia was more nervous than usual. She fidgeted with her hands, avoiding eye contact. Ethan prepared dinner in silence, sensing the tension in the air. And then she asked. The question he would never forget. She sat at the table, took a deep breath, and in a low, almost childish voice, said she needed to talk. She said she didn't want to lie anymore, that she couldn't go on like this. And she asked, as if apologizing before even speaking, would you mind if I went to a friend's house for a few days? The sentence fell like a bombshell. He stopped chopping vegetables, slowly raised his eyes, and met hers. He didn't need anything else. The confirmation was there. He wasn't a friend. He never had been. It was him. The other. The stranger who had invaded the space where before there had been only love. And then Ethan replied, his voice firm but choked, his throat burning as if swallowing shards of glass, you can go, and take advantage of it so you don't come back. Julia remained silent. Her eyes were watery, her body paralyzed. She hadn't expected this. Not like this. She thought he would beg. That he would try to understand. That he would ask for explanations. But all he did was release the chains. She picked up her purse with trembling hands. She didn't say anything else. She just left. Ethan stood there, heartbroken, but his pride intact. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was taking care of himself. She left. And he, finally, could fall. Alone, on the cold kitchen floor, silently crying over everything she had destroyed. He didn't know everything yet. He didn't know how deep the story went. But something even bigger, was coming. Something that would change everything again. The following weeks were filled with silence, pain, and rebuilding. Ethan sank into a silent isolation that left its mark on everything around him. He continued to go to work, sticking to his schedule, smiling at anyone who asked, but there was a void in his eyes that no one could fill. At home, she avoided the rooms where Julia usually stayed. She put away the picture frames, removed the wilted flowers from the vases, and left the bed unmade for days. He could still smell her perfume on some of the pillows, and it tore him apart into pieces too small to put back together. Every corner of the house was an involuntary reminder of everything they had experienced, and now it all hurt like a burn that insisted on flaring even after the wound had healed. Little by little, the routine they had built together began to unravel. She began dining out, lingering longer at work, walking streets she had previously avoided. It was her way of trying to move on, albeit with stumbling steps. Julia, on the other hand, saw her little universe collapse faster than she imagined. The man she traded her home, her marriage, her stability for wasn't the stuff of fairy tales. David was light, charming, and interesting, but he had no roots. He was a fire without kindling, an impulse without direction. After a few weeks, she began to notice his impatient gestures, his unexplained delays, his messages that went unanswered. Living together revealed that the initial enchantment hit a man who liked being desired, but not belonging. Conversations became short, nights cold, encounters few and far between. One day, he simply stopped showing up. No explanation, no goodbye. And there, sitting on the couch in an empty apartment, Julia understood. It was just a whim of his. And she, who once had everything, now had no one. Overcome by a suffocating regret, she tried to reach out to Ethan again. She began by sending shy messages, asking how he was, telling him she was still thinking about him. She received no response. She called a few times, always going straight to voicemail. Then she tried seeing the daughter of a mutual friend, hoping for an excuse to stop by. It didn't work. Ethan had built walls too high for any gesture from her to penetrate. And still, she persisted. She no longer knew who she was without him. And on a gray Thursday morning, she decided to go to the house where she had once been happy. In her hands, she carried a letter written with tears and regret, her face drawn, her pride broken. Ethan answered the door with a neutral expression. Surprised, but serene. She asked to talk. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded and made room. They sat at the kitchen table, the place where they had so often laughed, planned, and shared comfortable silences. Now the air was thick, almost suffocating. Julia began to speak, to apologize, to say she didn't know what she was doing, that she had been immature, that she even missed the way he cut the fruit in the morning. Ethan listened, motionless. He didn't react, didn't interrupt, just let her release the weight that was clearly consuming her. She said she couldn't sleep, that everything reminded her of him, that no one else made her feel safe, that he was her home. She said that if he would accept, she wanted to try again. She wanted to go back. Start over. And then he spoke. His voice low, firm, looking into her eyes as if he no longer felt pain, only memory. He said he didn't hate her. That there was no room for resentment in someone who had already mourned everything. He said he forgave her. But that he would never allow her to return. Because it wasn't a matter of resentment, but of dignity. That loving didn't mean accepting anything. And that the love she betrayed was real, but it hadn't survived. Julia wept silently, her head bowed, her hands restless. She begged him not to be so cold. Ethan sighed deeply. And then he said, with the calm of someone who has carried a burden for too long, "You want honesty? I'll give it to you. But not to hurt you. Just because I can't bear this alone anymore." She looked up, confused. He stood, walked to an old cabinet, and took out a small but weathered cardboard box. He placed it on the table. He opened it. Inside were envelopes. Photos. Prints. Julia frowned, uncomprehending. Then he began to tell her. He said that, months before all this happened, he had known about her involvement with David. That someone very close to David, his wife, had discovered the affair before Julia even imagined it. Upon finding out, Julia sought out Ethan. Not out of anger, but out of desperation. She showed him evidence. Screenshots of conversations, photos of the two of them together at the cultural center, notes exchanged. She said she didn't want a scandal. She just needed him to know. Ethan said he was in shock, that he spent sleepless nights trying to figure out what to do. He thought about confronting her, yelling, leaving. But in the end, he decided to wait. He wanted to see how far she would go. He wanted to know how much love she claimed to feel was genuine. Julia was trembling. Tears streamed down her face pale. She asked why he hadn't said anything. Why he'd let her continue. And Ethan responded with a sentence that landed like a punch in the already thin air of that kitchen, "Because I needed to see you choose me. And you chose him." The pain in her eyes now wasn't just regret, it was humiliation. Knowing she'd been watched, that everything had been seen, that the lies had been followed in silence, it destroyed her. Ethan added that all along, he'd known everything. That every time she said she was tired, he knew who she was with. That every excuse, every absence, he swallowed silently, waiting for her to come back on her own. But she didn't. And then came the final blow. Ethan pulled a photo from the box. It was David, standing next to a woman. His wife. And more than that, Julia's childhood best friend. They had lost touch in recent years, but the connection remained. Julia recognized it instantly. And she was devastated. The man she had destroyed her marriage for was married to someone she had known since adolescence. A woman who had welcomed her, who had supported her through difficult times. And now, realizing the extent of her own betrayal, Julia didn't know where to put her shame. Ethan explained that this woman had withdrawn from everything. She moved to another city, left social media, and quit her job. The humiliation was public. The messages Julia exchanged with David had been leaked by someone in their social circle. And she didn't know it. Julia collapsed. She fell to the kitchen floor, weeping like a lost child. She tried to speak, but no words came. Ethan just watched her. Not with contempt, but with the distant compassion of someone who no longer belongs to another's pain. He bent down, placed a hand on her shoulder, and said firmly, "I hope you find peace. But it's not here anymore." He stood, walked to the door, and left it open. She left without saying a word. Without looking back. And in that moment, everything inside her crumbled. Because it wasn't just the loss of the man who loved her. It was the loss of herself. Of the image she had of who she was. Of the certainty that there was a return. She understood, finally, that some choices cannot be undone. And that some doors, once closed, never open again. Julia walked aimlessly down the sidewalk, feeling as if her feet were carrying her instinctively, because her mind was no longer in control. Tears dried on her face in the cold night wind, but what truly burned was inside. A bitter desert opened up in her chest, not just from losing Ethan, but from realizing what she had become. Each step echoed as if she were stepping on the shards of all the wrong choices she had made. And now, not even silence was a refuge. Her conscience screamed. It screamed the truth she had tried to ignore for months. That absence was no excuse. That loneliness was no justification. That the mistake was hers alone. And that, no matter how much she hid behind her needs, in the end, she had destroyed the only place where she had ever been truly loved. The city seemed indifferent to her pain. Cars passed, people laughed on restaurant sidewalks, headlights changed colors, and everything went on as if nothing had happened. It was strange to be in freefall and the world kept spinning. Julia didn't know where to go. The apartment she'd shared with David was no longer hers. He'd disappeared, left everything behind, and she didn't even have the courage to go back for her things. The place was permeated by the farce they'd lived through. She couldn't face that space. She considered going to her sister's house, but didn't have the strength to explain. Finally, she ended up in a cheap hotel in the old part of town. The room was small, musty-smelling, with scratchy sheets. But it was what she deserved. And it was there, alone, staring at the stained ceiling, that she began writing the letter she would never deliver. A confession. A plea for forgiveness. An outburst. She wrote for hours, crying between the lines, as if she could wash away the guilt with ink. Meanwhile, Ethan also decided to move on, but quietly, without telling anyone. He got in his car the next day and drove to a coastal town 3 hours away. He needed to breathe new air, step on new sand, get away from the place where everything reminded him of what would never return. He rented a simple cottage near the sea and spent 2 days simply gazing at the horizon. He no longer felt anger. Only a profound weariness. As if everything that had been drained from him in the last few months now needed to be replenished with silence, with time. He didn't speak to anyone. He didn't respond to messages. He wanted to hear himself again. To understand who he was, now that everything that had been was no longer. And slowly, as the sea broke its waves leisurely against the sand, he began to feel something akin to lightness. As if the grief was finally fading, leaving in its place the possibility of starting over. It was on a cloudy afternoon, sitting in the cafe overlooking the sea, that he met her. Emma was at the next table, a cup of tea in her hands and an open, unread book. Her eyes fixed on the window, her mind far away. A meeting without pretense, without promises. But something about the silence shared between them drew him in. Ethan noticed the details, the way she held the mug with both hands, as if trying to warm herself from the inside out, her serene demeanor, and her gaze that, even distant, was welcoming. It was she who spoke first, with a simple comment about the weather. he responded. And they stayed there, talking for long minutes that seemed to stretch into hours. Nothing heavy, nothing deep. Just light. And light was all he needed. He discovered that Emma was an occupational therapist, had come to visit her sick mother, and used her days off to spend time near the sea. The conversation flowed as if they already knew each other, and when they said goodbye, they exchanged numbers with a genuine smile. In the days that followed, they continued seeing each other. They ate lunch together, walked along the sand, talked about books, movies, and pain. Ethan, without realizing it, began to open up. He spoke about the end of his marriage, the choices he couldn't stop, the pain of being replaced by someone he never had the courage to face. Emma listened without judgment. She didn't use clichés. She just listened, welcomed, and that was enough. The connection grew slowly, without urgency. It was a calm, respectful love. And more than that, it was a love that was possible. Because Emma wasn't there to fill in the gaps, but to walk alongside him. Ethan realized he was still capable of feeling. That there was still a whole heart inside him, even after everything. Meanwhile, Julia was going through a reverse process. Each day was a new loss. She tried to return to work at the cultural center, but the atmosphere had changed. Many knew about the scandal. Forced smiles, sidelong glances, hushed comments. She felt invisible and, at the same time, exposed. She couldn't take it. She quit and returned to her parents' house, where she found only judgment and silence. Her mother, though loving, kept a discreet distance. Her father didn't bring up the subject. It was as if she were an uncomfortable visitor everyone hoped would leave soon. And that hurt more than any scream. The loneliness was absolute. She had lost everything. And for the first time, she understood that losing someone isn't just about physical absence. It's about the pain of knowing you were someone's home, and chose to burn it down. He then decided to do what he'd been avoiding for weeks. He went after his old friend. David's wife. The one she'd betrayed so cowardly. He knocked on the door of a small house in the suburbs, an envelope in hand, his heart racing. The woman answered, serious, her face grim. Julia asked for just 2 minutes. You said you needed to talk. That you didn't want forgiveness, just to be heard. And with tears in her eyes, she began to speak. She told him everything. She said she hadn't known she and David were still married, that she believed their marriage was over. She said she felt like garbage for having caused so much damage, that she would regret every day of her life for betraying the trust of someone she once considered a sister. The woman listened without interrupting, arms crossed, expression impenetrable. When Julia finished, she apologized, turned her back, and left. But before closing the door, the woman said a single sentence that would forever resonate in Julia's memory: you didn't just destroy a marriage, you destroyed the image I had of you. And that is irreversible. That sentence marked the end of everything. Julia returned to the hotel and spent days locked away in silence. She began therapy. She read books about forgiveness, guilt, and rebuilding. Not with the illusion of winning Ethan back, but with the desire to one day be able to forgive herself. There was no longer room for her in his life, and she knew it. But there was still a long road ahead within herself. A road full of obstacles she had laid herself. And which she now had to traverse, alone. Months passed. Ethan and Emma became a discreet, mature couple, building everything from scratch, unhurriedly. He returned to the city, but he wasn't the same. He was calmer, more determined. He learned to trust again, learned to dream again. One day, leaving a market with Emma, he passed Julia on the sidewalk. She saw him first. She stopped. Their eyes met. She was different. Thinner, her hair tied back, a serene but marked expression. Ethan hesitated. Emma noticed, took his hand affectionately, and he approached. Julia smiled, a shy, pained smile. She said she was happy for him. That he deserved it. That Emma seemed like a good woman. Ethan thanked her with a gentle nod. They were silent for a few seconds. Until Julia said she now understood what true love was. And that she regretted taking so long. Ethan simply replied that time teaches, but takes its toll. And that he only hoped she would use all this to become a better person. They parted with a light look, without promises. And they went in opposite directions, as those who have already completed their cycle must. Life had finally placed each of them where they belonged. And love, though wounded, had survived. Not the old kind, but the new kind. The kind born of pain, respect, and the courage to begin again. The days that followed that brief reunion between Ethan and Julia dragged on in a dense, but no longer painful, silence. It was as if time was finally allowing each emotion to find its proper place, no longer overflowing, no longer screaming within his chest. Ethan continued to live with Emma, still cautiously, unhurriedly, but now more confident, more aware of his choices. Her presence was gentle, undemanding, and yet firm enough to make him realize that true love can also be light. He no longer sought what he had lost, nor did he long to regain what was left behind, and it was this detachment that made everything clearer. There were still marks, of course, and always would be. But now, the marks were like old scars that he viewed without revulsion, simply as part of the journey that had brought him here. Julia, on the other hand, was facing the most arduous process of all, rebuilding her own identity. For the first time, she wasn't seeking justifications, nor was she blaming circumstances. She was face to face with her own essence, trying to understand where she had stopped recognizing herself. She continued therapy regularly, and even in the sessions where silence prevailed, she learned something new. She began noting small advances, being able to sleep through the night, making coffee in the morning without crying, walking streets she used to walk with Ethan without feeling the ground slip away from her. It wasn't a linear path. Many days, the pain returned with a vengeance, a smell, a song, a similar face was enough. But now she allowed the pain to come, and no longer hid it. She began engaging in social projects, seeking new courses, re-establishing family relationships, and asking forgiveness from people she had hurt. Some forgave her, others not, but the gesture was not in vain. There was a new urgency within her, to become someone better. Not to prove anything, but because she finally understood the harm she had caused, and she no longer wanted to be able to repeat it. One rainy morning, she stood before a mirror and asked herself who she wanted to be from now on. She didn't answer with words, but it was then that she decided that, even if love never returned, even if Ethan was just a distant memory, she would need to be someone who would never cause that kind of pain to anyone again. And that required more courage than anything she had done up until that point. A silent courage, without an audience, without applause. But genuine. Meanwhile, Ethan and Emma continued to build a serene routine. It was different. Emma didn't suffocate him with promises or pressure. She was simply there, day after day, with a constant presence and honest words. He discovered that love also meant allowing oneself to receive. With her, he learned to share life, not as someone who depends, but as someone who adds to it. One night, when they arrived together from a short trip to a nearby town, Ethan watched her sleeping on the couch with a book on her lap and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Not the peace of escape, but the peace of knowing they were exactly where they were meant to be. He grabbed a blanket, carefully covered her, and silently gave thanks. Not to life, not to fate, but to his own resilience. For not letting himself be destroyed, for bearing the weight of betrayal, and yet, not hardening his heart. One sunny weekend, Ethan was invited by a mutual friend to an informal lunch. He accepted out of politeness, and when he arrived, he was surprised to see Julia among the guests. It wasn't intentional, she also seemed uncomfortable, but no one there knew the full story. For a few minutes, they avoided each other. She kept to discreet conversations, he occupied himself with the children running around the yard. Until, late in the afternoon, they found themselves alone in the kitchen, looking for something to drink. The silence between them was respectful but tense. Ethan was the first to speak. He said he hoped she was okay. Julia, with firm eyes, replied that she was still trying, but that she now knew herself well enough not to lie. She said that every mistake had a price, and that she paid hers every day. The sincerity in her voice wasn't a plea for a return, nor even an apology, it was simply a truth spoken with courage. Ethan nodded and replied that he hoped she would rebuild, because deep down, everyone deserves to find peace after chaos. That moment finally sealed the cycle that had begun to close months ago. There was no more hurt. No more resentment. Just the mature awareness that some people come into our lives to teach us how we no longer want to feel. And that, as painful as it may be, is also love. A love that transforms, that says goodbye, that liberates. In the following days, Ethan received an email from Julia. It was short and to the point. She thanked him for listening that afternoon, for being kind, and for, even without realizing it, helping her move on. She said she wouldn't write anymore, wouldn't interfere in his life, but that she sincerely hoped he would be happy, with or without her. Ethan read it and didn't respond. Not because he was angry, but because he understood it didn't need a response. Sometimes, silence is the only answer that closes a door with dignity. In the midst of all this, an unexpected invitation to speak at a local university arrived. Ethan, who had always kept his personal life private, was asked to speak about ethics, values, and integrity in the corporate environment, where he was highly respected. He initially declined, but Emma encouraged him to accept. She said it might be time to share his story, not with details, but with truths. On the day of the talk, speaking before dozens of students, Ethan spoke about choices, about loss, about the value of loyalty. Without naming names, without getting into drama, but with a calm strength that touched everyone who listened. At the end, he received a standing ovation. And in that applause, he felt something different. It wasn't pride, it was liberation. Julia, for her part, went back to school. She enrolled in a psychology program and began volunteering at an institution that supported women in difficult emotional situations. She told her colleagues that she felt useful there. That she wanted to help other women avoid losing themselves, as she once had. She was still alone, but she no longer felt lonely. She was relearning to live with the essentials. She had difficult days, relapses, but now she knew where to seek support. She understood the value of silence, and even more so, of listening. I had hope, but no longer illusion. Eventually, Ethan and Emma decided to live together. There was no party, no fanfare. Just a peaceful move into a house with a garden, a porch, and stacks of books. The daughter of a couple of friends used to visit them on Sundays, and once, when Ethan asked her what she wanted to be when she grew up, she replied with a twinkle in her eye that she wanted to be happy like that, just like you two together. He smiled, looked at Emma, and understood what that meant. Life hadn't given him back what he'd lost. But it had offered him something new. Something he perhaps didn't know he deserved. And now, there was only one step left until everything would be at peace. A final gesture. A complete goodbye. But that step wouldn't be his. It would be Julia's. And she already knew what she needed to do. Because in some stories, redemption doesn't come to fix things. It only comes to bring closure. And it was time to also close within herself everything that had once prevented her from being whole. It was late autumn when Julia bought her ticket. She didn't tell anyone, didn't write a note, or leave any clues about where she was going. She carried only a backpack with basic clothing, her cell phone turned off, and a leather-bound notebook where she had written, in slow, precise handwriting, every fragment of what she had learned in the last few months. It wasn't an escape, not this time. It was a crossing. She felt she needed to get away and, for the first time, look at herself from a new place, free from the gaze of others, far from judgment, and, even more so, far from pity. She wanted to silence the voices that constantly reminded her of what she had been, to perhaps discover what she could still be. Her destination was a small town in the countryside, almost forgotten on maps, but with a community arts school that offered shelter and courses for women starting over. Arriving there, she gave her name with the humility of someone who knew nothing was guaranteed anymore. And she was accepted. They welcomed her with little ceremony, as if they already knew her. She was placed in a small house by the lake, shared with 2 other women in the silence of reconstruction. No one asked about the past, only about the next day's plans. In the first few weeks, Julia washed dishes for the local kitchen, organized workshops, and participated in nightly gatherings with broken but not defeated women. Hearing so many stories of pain, abandonment, and overcoming without an audience made her realize that her suffering was not unique, and that perhaps because of that, it was finally understandable. Every late-night conversation before the fire, every tear shared in a low voice, every silence shared with those who had also lost themselves, were now part of the process. For the first time, she didn't need to appear strong or explain herself. There, she was simply a woman trying to learn to live with the choices she had made, and that was enough. On the other side, in his now simpler routine, Ethan woke with ease. The first rays of dawn filtered through the curtains of the house he now shared with Emma, and he found in every detail a reflection of what it was like to live peacefully. He still thought, occasionally, of Julia. Not with pain, nor longing. But with a kind of compassion that only those who have been deeply hurt and healed slowly can feel. He knew, with the lucidity of someone who has hit rock bottom, that not all wounds heal with anger. Some heal with respect for one's own silence. Emma, as always, was a serene presence. She didn't demand proof of love, she didn't seek theatrical gestures. She enjoyed the little things, sitting on the living room floor reading while he listened to music on the porch, preparing a simple dinner together, looking into his eyes with a calmness that said more than any declaration. Ethan was learning to allow himself to be happy again. Not exaggeratedly, but fully. One morning, while sorting through some old documents, he found the wedding note, the only one he'd kept. It was Julia's handwritten invitation, with the crooked handwriting of someone who knew no design but wrote with emotion. He read the paper with a half-smile. Did it hurt? A little. But not because he wanted it back. It hurt because of the memory of the man he'd been, and how much he'd had to tear himself apart to rebuild himself. He put the note back. Not in the back of a drawer, but in an envelope with other keepsakes. Some deserve to be forgotten. Others, just organized. And move on. It was during this period that he received a letter. Handwritten, with no sender identification on the envelope. He recognized the handwriting the moment he touched the paper. He opened it calmly. Julia had written from somewhere unknown, saying she didn't expect a reply, nor any contact, but that she needed to express words that no longer fit in silence. She said she didn't want to ask for forgiveness, because she had already understood that forgiveness, when true, can never be asked for, only received. That I would never return to his life, not for lack of desire, but out of respect for the new path he had forged. She described what she had been doing, how she was rediscovering the meaning of small things, how she had learned, from complete strangers, to be true. She concluded by saying she wished him and Emma a life full of sincerity, of quiet laughter and lingering glances, and that, wherever she was, she would carry the certainty that she had been truly loved, and that this, even though lost, had been the greatest gift of her life. Ethan read the entire letter standing at the kitchen table. Emma arrived shortly after and found him teary-eyed but serene. He handed the letter to her, saying nothing. Emma read it in silence. Then she came over and simply hugged him, no questions asked. No insecurity, no pressure. Just a firm gesture, as if to say, it's over. And it was true. It was over. Ethan put the letter away, not in the same envelope with the old papers, but in a different one. Separate. Because each chapter of life deserves its own space. In the small town where Julia now lived, the atmosphere was beginning to change. Orange leaves filled the narrow streets with color. She spent her days teaching painting to children with learning disabilities. Connecting with them was challenging but deeply moving. Every smile, every stroke on the paper, was like a silent reminder that there was still beauty in simple things. One of the boys once handed her a poorly drawn drawing of a woman with open hands beneath a shower of stars. Julia asked what it was. He replied, "It's you trying to catch up with everything you lost." She cried that afternoon. Not because of the pain of the past, but because she realized that, even without knowing it, that child had translated her soul. At the end of that month, she received an unexpected visitor. The woman who had been betrayed by David, her former friend, showed up at the school with a box of donations. She had clothes for the children and some books. Julia froze when she saw her, but the other woman smiled. She said she didn't want to talk about the past. She was only stopping by because she knew about the project and wanted to help. But before leaving, she said something that would change the rest of the story: you don't have to spend your whole life punishing yourself to be forgiven. Sometimes, moving forward is what most honors what was destroyed. After that, she left. And for the first time, Julia felt light. The following week, she organized an art exhibition with her students. Small paintings, all with the same theme, a new beginning. She painted one herself, and signed. It was a simple landscape, with a road between dry trees, and in the background, a sunset. It was a clear symbol, an end and a beginning on the same horizon. The painting sold before the exhibition even began, bought by a woman who never knew its story, but who said she felt something when she looked at that road. Meanwhile, Ethan was promoted at work. But more important than the position was the way he began to be heard. Many, upon learning about his journey, began seeking him out for advice, conversations, and reflection. He never exposed Julia. But he shared his experience as someone who had been broken, deceived, and yet chose not to become bitter. Emma admired him for this. She said his strength lay not in overcoming, but in his humanity. And perhaps that was the key to everything. That winter, sitting before the fireplace in their new house, Ethan and Emma talked about adoption. There was no rush, but there was a desire. Emma had always wanted to be a mother, and Ethan now felt he had the space within himself to give love again, without reservations, without fear of loss. They said they would think about it together. And that night, as he closed his eyes, he no longer thought about what he had lost. Only about what was yet to come. On the other side, Julia, lying in her small bed, looked out the window at the clear sky and whispered to herself that she now understood: starting over isn't about forgetting, it's about learning to remember without bleeding. And in that calm, each in their own corner, the two, finally, found peace. At the turn of the year, the center where Julia worked organized a closing retreat. The women gathered around a campfire and, one by one, read aloud letters written to their past selves. Some wept, others smiled. Julia, with the paper between her fingers, hesitated for a moment before beginning. Her letter offered no apologies, no pleas. It was, above all, a farewell to the woman she had been. The one who chose the easy way out, the one who destroyed a home out of need, the one who forgot who she was to please those who never truly saw her. She said, in a firm voice, that the most serious betrayal she had committed was not against her husband, nor against her friend, it was against herself, convincing herself she needed someone else to feel alive. When she finished, there was silence. But not the silence of embarrassment. It was a silence of welcome, of deep understanding. Because everyone there, in some way, had betrayed themselves at some point along the way. And now, they were trying to make amends, one small choice at a time. The next morning, Julia woke before sunrise, put on her shoes, poured hot coffee in a clay mug, and walked to the lake. She sat on the edge of the wooden bridge and watched the mist dance over the water. She no longer felt the despair that had plagued her months ago. Nor the anguish. What remained now was a gentle melancholy, like someone who accepts that not everything can be fixed, but almost everything can be transformed. She took the small brooch she had worn at her wedding, the only object she still had from that time, from her pocket and threw it into the water with a sigh. Not with pain, but with release. It was symbolic. It didn't erase the past, but it made it clear that the future no longer depended on it. Meanwhile, Ethan's house was more vibrant than ever. Emma had begun making small improvements to the garden, and he was slowly learning to appreciate the idea of putting down roots in new soil. They adopted a shelter dog, a stray with sad eyes and an agitated demeanor, who soon became part of their routine. Ethan laughed as he watched the dog mess up the flower pots and run around the living room with Emma's shoe in its mouth. It was the kind of light-hearted chaos he never knew he could want. Over time, that house filled with details that didn't come with promises or expectations, but with the solidity of everyday life. Evenings were filled with simple dinners, soft music, and conversations about the day. And in the mornings, when he woke to the sound of birds outside and Emma by his side, he knew he had arrived where he needed to be. It was in March that they received the news that the adoption process had been approved. An 8-year-old girl, with watchful eyes and shy speech, had been waiting for a family for 2 years. Their first meeting was restrained but full of meaning. Ethan felt a tightness in his chest when he saw her look, not out of fear, but because he recognized there the same distrust he had once carried within himself. Emma, with her quiet sensitivity, calmly built bridges, without invading any space. Within a few weeks, the girl was calling them both by name. And when, one Sunday afternoon, she ran up to Ethan and called him Dad for the first time, he couldn't hold back the tears. It wasn't tears of sadness, but of fulfillment. As if, despite everything, the world could still be generous to those who have learned to stand up for themselves without letting their hearts harden. Julia, at the same time, received an unexpected invitation to return to the city and speak at a conference on overcoming an emotional reconstruction. Her first reaction was to decline. She was afraid to go back, to rediscover her ghosts, to feel everything again. But something inside her told her it was necessary. That facing the past head-on was the final step toward truly leaving it behind. She prepared her speech carefully. She didn't omit the betrayal. She accepted the consequences. She spoke of the shame, the isolation, the pain of looking in the mirror and not liking who she saw. But she also spoke of the strength she found where she least expected it, of the hands that helped her when she no longer had the courage to ask for help. And above all, she spoke of the capacity each of us has to change, even after the most serious mistake. At the end of the talk, there was applause. Lots of it, but what touched her most was the approach of a young woman, with tears in her eyes, who said, "Thank you for showing that it's not the mistake that defines who we are, but what we do after it." Julia smiled sincerely. She knew she had finally accomplished what she needed to accomplish. In the following days, she decided not to stay. She said goodbye to the city that had once been the scene of her downfall, and also her hardest lesson, and returned to the countryside, where she now maintained her project with children and wrote a book about the process she had experienced. Not to be famous, nor to explain herself, but because she believed that pain, when healed, can become a bridge to others. One afternoon, without any pretense, Ethan found that book in a local bookstore. "You read the back cover." He recognized the title, but it didn't make an impact. He flipped through a few pages. Excerpts from letters, fragments of therapy sessions, accounts of encounters with women undergoing reconstruction. It was a raw, honest, unvarnished book. And for the first time, he felt proud of her. Not for having done what she did, but for not having stopped there. For having kept going, for having made something of the chaos. He left the book on the shelf. I didn't need to take it home. The story was already written inside. When he returned, he found Emma and her daughter laughing in the backyard. He sat beside her, watched the scene, and knew the cycle was complete. Not because he had forgotten the past, but because he had learned to be happy despite it. Months later, Julia received a letter from her old friend, David's wife. She said she had read the book. That she had cried, yes. But that she felt relief. Because, somehow, it had also healed a part of her. The letter ended by saying she didn't know if they would ever be friends again, but that she wished for peace. Julia closed her eyes after reading. And she understood, with a new clarity, that not every bond needs to be rekindled to be healed. Sometimes, the scar is enough. Forgiveness, even silent, can be what saves both sides. And so, time passed. And each character, each broken soul, found their place of healing. Ethan, by choosing to move on with dignity. Julia, by facing the abyss and deciding to start over. Emma, by loving lightly. Their daughter, by being welcomed with a love that asked for no explanation. All transformed by pain, but not defined by it. If you've made it this far, with a heavy heart, perhaps even tears in your eyes, tell me in the comments what you felt. What part of this story touched you most? Do you think you would have forgiven in Ethan's place? Or that you could have gotten back on your feet like Julia? I'd love to hear your opinion. So comment below. And of course, if you enjoyed this story and want to hear others as profound as this one, subscribe to the channel now. There's a lot of powerful stuff coming, real stories told with emotion, without filters, and with truths that move you deeply. And let this story serve as a mirror. Betrayal isn't just a slip-up. It's a choice that can destroy not only the one who loves, but also the one who betrays. It leaves holes where there was trust, turns good memories into sharp pains, and often erases forever the chance to rebuild. Families torn apart, futures torn apart, hearts torn apart, all for a moment of impulse, for a fleeting desire. And so, here on this channel, we make it clear, we do not support any kind of betrayal. Never. Choose to love truthfully. And if you're going to leave, let it be with honesty. Because love, once betrayed, is never the same again. And sometimes, it never returns.